Paweł Gancarczyk from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Paweł's excellent research on late medieval music and music sources from Central Europe is familiar to most of us. His work on Petrus Wilhelmi de Grudencz, a 15th century composer, is particularly relevant to the lecture series that looks, among others, for Central European networks in the past and present. Petrus Wilhelmi's work was known on the wider Central European territory that did not know boundaries as we feel them today or see them today. Also, this topic has always, since the unexpected discovery of this composer, connected Czech and Polish musicologists with Jaromi, our still lively remembered teacher in the past. And let me say that for the rest of his life, it was his favorite story that he told in a very persuasive way at Christmas parties, how he made this surprising discovery while preparing already overtired last proofs of critical transcriptions of Petrus Wilhelmi's motets, screening, but he did not know that it is Petrus Wilhelmi, screening with half open eyes randomly over first letters of the motet texts. And since that, all Prague students read first letters of motet sequences and hymn texts to hunt for other forgotten authors. And today, when we return to the present, our Polish colleague Paweł Gancarczyk continues in Jaromi's work, and his major publication, a monograph on the composer, is to be published this summer. Paweł Gancarczyk is associate professor at the Institute of Art of the Polish Academy of Sciences, head of the Department of Musicology, as well as editor-in-chief of the quarterly Musica, Music. His main areas of research are the musical culture of Central Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, manuscript studies, and early music printing. His publication, La musique et la révolution de l'imprimerie, and so on, received the 2016 Prix de Muse Prize. And he edited also publication Ars Musica and in Context in Medieval and Early Modern Culture that was published in Warsaw in 2016. Paweł was principal investigator of the HERA project Sound Memories, the musical past in late medieval and early modern Europe in years 2016 and until 19, on which participated also colleagues from the Charles University Prague, today members of our project. Since 2019, Paweł has been the principal investigator in the 3-year project Music in the Teutonic Order State in Prussia, Sources, Repertories, Contexts, funded by the National Science Center, Poland. Paweł's talk today will focus on late medieval Utraquist chant books from Bohemia that contain Petrus' polyphonic works. As the abstract of the lecture informs us, a number of previously unknown sources of Petrus Wilhelmi's works have been found since Jaromi's discovery. They enable us to look in a new light at his music, to date seen mainly through the prism of Utraquist manuscripts, such as the Specia codex and the Franus codex, both from the turn of the 15th and the 16th centuries. It turns out that the Bohemian sources often provide us with versions of Petrus' pieces that are seriously deformed. In Paweł's paper, he would like to show a number of examples of compositions of this kind. His aim is, on the other hand, to attempt a reconstruction of Petrus' music in a form as close as possible to the original. On the other, to demonstrate the musical practice of the Utraquist. Individual compositions will be shown against the wider panorama of musical developments encountered in Central Europe in the 15th century. So welcome again, Paweł. The screen is now all yours.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for this nice introduction, and thank you all of you, so Hanna Fulchowa-Werner and Zsuzsa Czagań and Ewa Weselowska, for nice invitation for this lecture. I'm a little bit nervous because it's my first official lecture online. As you know, I have no so many students, so I have no so many experiences in teaching via Zoom or something like this, but I hope it will work today. So first I start to share my screen. Yes, I hope it works. Can you see my presentation? Yes, thank you very much. So the title of my presentation is Petrus Wilhelmi, Utraquist Sources and New Facts About His Music. And Hannah told several words about discovery of Czerny, and in fact, it was a little bit confusing because I wanted to start with words of Czerny. So to start with, I'd like to remind us of what Czerny said when he recalled his discovery of Petrus Wilhelmi. Okay. I'm sorry, but by coincidence, I paused my presentation. So maybe I try to do this again. Yes, okay. It's a very long presentation, so it needs a little bit time for work. Yes, so quotation. It was a warm summer evening in 1971. J.C., so Jaromi, was proofreading his study of the oldest Bohemian motets. He was tired and somewhat bored. He had checked Petrus' already well-known acrostic in the text Pneuma Eucharistianum. For some unfathomable reason, tiredness, boredom, he started spelling the beginning of the second text, Veni vere illustrator, lux honoris, Wilhelmi, goodness. And what about the third text? Dator ea gratiarum rex virtutis, de Grudencz. Since that time, J.C. reads articles in the daily press in the same way. End of quotation. This quotation reveals important traits of Czerny's personality, the ones we like so much in him, his self-detachment and his sense of humor. However, in the context of today's lecture, it's more important to remember that he picked up Petrus Wilhelmi's trail while studying Bohemian sources. These were mostly Utraquist manuscripts. Czerny was very familiar with these sources, and it was there that he discovered a number of songs and motets with the Petrus acrostic, which later were successfully linked to Petrus Wilhelmi de Grudencz. The Bohemian sources were the point of departure for research into this previously unknown composer and poet. They were the ones that were gradually joined by sources from Poland, Germany, and Austria. Czerny asked himself more than once how the work of Petrus came to be so widely known among the Utraquists. How and when did his motets and songs find their way to Bohemia? And why did they continue to be copied there until as late as the beginning of the 17th century? It's now 50 years since that warm summer evening in 1971. Some of the questions posed by Czerny still remain unanswered in spite of the clear progress in research both into the Utraquist manuscripts and Petrus Wilhelmi. During that half a century, new sources and pieces appeared in the catalogue of his works. New documents relating to his biography have also been discovered. These developments are reflected in numerical data. When Czerny's article about quotation, an unknown composer from the times of Defy, end of quotation, appeared in Hudební věda in 1975, one could talk of 20 pieces by Petrus and 27 sources which transmitted them. By the time of the opera Omnia edition being published in Krakow in 1993, we already have 22 compositions and 38 sources. And by now, these numbers have grown to 34 pieces and 50 sources. What is very significant is that these new sources come mainly from outside Bohemia, from Germany, Poland, Slovakia, and Austria. In Czerny's day, the Utraquist manuscripts were dominant. By now, they are in a minority. There are also fewer pieces that are preserved only in Utraquist sources. At present, the map of sources of the composer's works encompasses an extensive area of Central Europe. Its extreme points are marked by Frankfurt am Main in the west, Lviv in the east, Trent in the south, and the Duchy of Mazovia in the north. As we can see on the map, where the provenance of the sources is indicated by red points, Bohemia is still at the center, but it isn't a center as strong as it was in Czerny's days. We need to overlay this information regarding the geography of sources with new findings concerning their chronology. Particularly important are the proportions between the early sources, among which I count those which were created or may have been created during the composer's lifetime, and the late sources, dated to the period from the end of the 15th century to the beginning of the 17th. This is what Czerny had to on the subject in 1993. The sources created during Petrus Wilhelmi's lifetime survive only as a small range and include negligible number of his compositions. Apart from fragments, only 4 songs, 3 motets, and 1 kyrie. The main part of Petrus's legacy is found only in the later transmissions, which are probably copies of copies. End of quotation. Today, this opinion would be difficult to maintain, in spite of the fact that the dates of the composer's life had been moved back. Czerny assumed that Petrus was born around the year 1400 and died around 1480. However, today we know that he was born in 1392 and died earlier than previously thought, after 1452. The manuscripts written during Petrus' life now constitute 1/3 of all sources and include a decisive majority of his 34 compositions. Only 4 pieces appear for the first time in manuscript from the end of the 15th and from the 16th centuries. This is because the later discoveries to a significant degree concern early sources. I include here, for instance, the manuscript from Opava from the 1430s, the Göttingen fragments from Silesia from the late 1440s, and manuscript 1084 from Leipzig from the early 1450s. Recently, I succeeded in also adding to these sources a fragment from Mazovia, where with great difficulty one can decipher the descantus from the song Phonincorum et Icorum. In this context, it's also worth mentioning that at present, the fragments from Wysokie Mito, preserved in the archive in Usti nad Orlicy, which I date to the 1450s, are recognized as the oldest Bohemian manuscript containing Petrus music. The other Utraquist sources, regarded by Czerny as so significant, are much later. The Specialny codex comes from the end of the 15th century, while the others are dated to the period from the year 1500 to the beginning of the 17th century. Sources discovered in the recent decades are of key significance for my paper today. They allow us to look from a different perspective at the compositions of Petrus Wilhelmi, known to us until now mainly from the Utraquist manuscripts. I will try to demonstrate it using a number of selected songs. I will focus on the issues of the rhythmic shape and the texture of these pieces. I will also refer to the musical form, leaving aside the no less important and complex issues concerning, for example, their textual layer. He was poet as well. I discuss some of the subjects in my book, Petrus Wilhelmi de Grudencz and Central European Music in the 15th Century, which will appear in June, I hope, at present in Polish, but will probably to be followed by an English version. I'd also like to mention that quite recently, a new edition of the works of Petrus Wilhelmi has been added to the publication plans of the Monumenta Musce in Polonia series at the Institute of Art of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Today's lecture relates to the preparation for this edition. I'd like to start my deliberations with the simple song for two voices, Prelusti e Lucentia. I already devoted much attention to it in my article Changing Identities of Songs by Petrus Wilhelmi de Grudencz, published in Hudební Věda in 2017. This song is preserved in 18 sources, and my attention was drawn in particular to the Košice fragments from Slovakia, dated to circa 1465. This is the oldest source of this composition, not taken into consideration by Czerny, who in his edition used the version from the Specjalny codex. Two features in particular drew my attention. The first is the metric instability, the alternation of duple and triple metre, a feature noted by Czerny as a kind of differentia specifica of Petrus' songs. Its other feature is the appearance of the series of parallel fifths in the endings of the two parts of the composition. Detailed analysis of sources and variants led me to conclude that in fact the song was in regular triple metre in Prolatio Major, while the endings originally did not contain any parallel fifths. Petrus might not have been a genius of his times, but he was familiar with the contemporary harmonic tendencies, including for Bourdon. Rhythmic instability and parallel fifths resulted from a number of simple errors, or perhaps awkward attempts at innovation, revealed in the Utraquist manuscripts, while the Catholic manuscripts, including the oldest one from Košice, preserved the correct versions. Prelusti e Lucentia is one of the Petrus' most often performed and recorded works, and the corrupted version from the Specjalny codex has become established in the memory of performers and listeners. That music originally had different characteristics, close to Petrus' other songs from the 1430s. Fortunately, only a few notes are missing in the Košice fragments, and I managed to reconstruct a version which is undoubtedly closer to the original than the one with which we have been familiar until now. Metric instability can also be found in a few other songs by Petrus that have not been analyzed till now in such detail as Prelusti e Lucentia. A significant example here is another Marian song, Praesidiorum Erogatrix. It's a rare example of a tripartite song, different from the most common bipartite songs, composed of the versus and repetitio. Prelusti e Lucentia is a typical example of that form. In tripartite songs, the parts are of different lengths, and the middle part is differentiated from the other parts in some way. In the case of Praesidiorum Erogatrix, the first part has alternating duple and triple metre, the second duple metre, and the third part regular triple metre. The logic of the form would indicate that the parts 1 and 3 should have the same metre, but the Utraquist sources transmit to us a version of the song that differs from the expected one. Obviously, it's the first part that causes the problem. Basing his analysis on the Franus codex, Jaromir Czerny interpreted its metre as unstable, mainly duple, sometimes triple. Let us recall the beginning of this work in the interpretation of Czech ensemble Schora Gregoriana Pragensis. Czerny discovered Praesidiorum Erogatrix in 3 Utraquist sources: the Specialny Codex from the end of the 15th century, the Franus Codex from 1505, and the Gradual from Chrudim from 1530. It's easy to see that they were all produced many years after the composer's death. Martin Stejelin added to these 3 sources further one, unfortunately incomplete. These are the Göttingen fragments from the end of the 1440s. In them we find only a fragment of the higher voice, the discantus, most of the music from the first and second parts, and the beginning, mainly in the form of stems, from the third part. It's the very bottom of this page. Sources from Central Europe, including the Göttingen fragments, generally don't use mensural signs, and metric divisions have to be interpreted from the way of graphic composition of notes and rests. Where the first part is concerned, it's easy to identify repeated sets: semibrevis, 2 minim rests, and a minim, at the end of which we often see a short line or a dot to indicate or as punctus divisionis. This arrangement points to the triple division of the semibrevis, that is prolatio major, and the minim should be interpreted as anacrusis. In Utraquist sources, in such places, there is only one rest, which meant that Czerny read this fragment in prolatio minor. This minor difference, combined with a few other details, makes it possible to read the whole part in triple metre. Since I'm not certain about the beginning of this composition, a few notes are illegible, I present a comparison of the second and third segments of the first part. It's also worth noting here that the version from the Göttingen fragments is a fourth lower. As for the second and third parts, metrically, they are the same as the versions from the Utraquist manuscripts, although they contain minor melodic variants. This means that the composition had a clear formal plan with extreme parts in triple metre and middle part in double match. The Göttingen fragments don't include the tenor, so we do not know what that part would look like, although making it fit into the new rhythmic shape of the discantus would not present major difficulties. However, let us stop at this point, leave our Praesidiorum Erogatrix aside, and move on to the third song that we are concerned with today, Preconia Etroclita. This time we are dealing with a three-voice composition, as were the two preceding ones dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. In terms of its form, it's another type of song, a through-composed one, probably not divided into any parts originally, in spite of what the Utraquist manuscript leads us to believe. Let us quote Jaromir Czerny again. In the song Preconia Etroclita, Petrus probably reached for the kind of popular polyphony known locally, described by two then contemporary treatises as trumpetum. The tenor in this song fulfills his function only in the cadential fragments of the composition. Throughout the rest, it is built on the model of a fanfare melodics using frequent leaps of fourth and fifths, in this way imitating perfectly the sound of the trumpet. At the same time, this song displays a wide range of strict and rhythmic imitations in the fast parlando fragments. End of quotation. Let us listen to Preconia Etroclita performed again by Schola Gregoriana Pragensis. I'm sorry. Again. According to Czerny, Preconia Etroclita would be an example of trumpetum, a musical genre defined in a number of treatises from Central Europe and often identified there with a related genre known as stampetum or stampania. A Silesian treatise from the beginning of the 15th century defines trumpetum as follows. Trumpetum and stampania may have 2 or 3 parts and often move in the interval of the fifth or in diapason or the octave, in the manner of a trumpet or a lyre, as in Tripudium and Authentica Divum Natalitium. End of quotation. Trumpetum is thus a vocal composition where, through the use of specific melodic figures, intervals of the fifth and the octaves, one imitates the manner of playing instruments. The Latin names tuba and lyra probably refer not only to the trumpet and the lyre, but also to the whole groups of wind instruments like shawms, like trumpets, and string instruments, for instance, the lute. Only one of the three examples given at the end of this definition has been identified. In a fragment from the beginning of the 15th century from Eastern Franconia, unfortunately I don't have a good reproduction of this fragment, there is a song with the incipit Authentica haec regina, most probably close to the Authentica quoted in the treatise from Silesia. It's likely to have been a composition for three voices, of which only the highest voice and the middle voice without the ending have been preserved. Perhaps in the song from Franconia, we don't encounter the intervals of the fifth and the octave quite so often, but the influence of instrumental melodics is clear. The voices move in small rhythmic values, minims are dominant, often repeated at the same pitch. The song consists of two parts, and this corresponds to the definition of trumpetum, which could be bi- or tripartite. Melodically, Preconia Heteroclita seems to be similar to Authentica haec regina, and thus meet the requirements of the definition of trumpetum. The form of the composition may be a problem, more likely one part, but let us put this detail to one side, as much more serious objections emerge on the horizon. The source documentation of Preconia Heteroclita is identical with that of Praesidiorum Erogatrix, a puzzling but probably coincidental convergence. Czerny had three Utraquist copies at his disposal, Specjalnik, Franus, and Chrudim, and from them he selected the Franus codex for transcription. Martin Stejelin added to this Bohemian trio another source from Silesia from the end of the 1440s, that is the Göttingen fragments. Fortunately, this time fragments of all three voices have been preserved, and this allows us to make a number of comments about the version of the song copied in them. The most important difference concerns the tenor, which is textless, as well as having a totally different rhythmic shape from the Utraquist sources. Let us note, by the way, that under it is written the word Jorlavie, Jorlavie. This might be linked to Machaut's chanson Jour à Jour la vie, known in Central Europe under this title, but this would be a mistaken association since these two songs don't have any links. The tenor of Preconia Heteroclita is in longer values. There are no repetitions of notes, and there is no sign of any parlando. If we knew only the version from the Göttingen fragments, we would probably not link it to trumpetum, as the fast repetitions of notes that, according to Czerny, imitate trumpeting appear mainly in the tenor. Moreover, the problem of the form makes its comeback. In the Göttingen fragments, it was undoubtedly neither bi- or tripartite, but, as I have mentioned, was in one part and was through composed. Let us also note, by the way, that this composition, like Praesidiorum Erogatrix, was notated a fourth lower than in the Bohemian sources. It thus appears that the Utraquists, wanting to adapt the tenor for singing, broke up the longer rhythmic values into series of repeated minims and semi-minims, allowing in this way the underlaying of the song quite long text. A byproduct of this vocalization was the creation of a melody which is more likely to be associated with instrumental music. This procedure brings to mind the anonymous Ave Coronata Alma Parens, throughout familiar from the Specjalnik and Franus codices, quoted in theoretical treatises as an example of the motet genre. Czerny noted that in the Utraquist sources, the tenor long values were broken up into a series of short notes, thus blurring the original structure of the work based on strict isorhythm. The conclusion this leads to is that this kind of vocalization of the tenor was a more widespread phenomenon, and the Utraquist repertoire may contain more songs and motets that underwent this treatment. One can also look for such a procedure in other works by Petrus Wilhelmi. And at this point, I'd like to return to Praesidiorum Erogatrix, which I left when I concentrated on the reconstruction of the Discantus. As I have already mentioned, the Göttingen fragments don't contain a single note from the tenor of that song. We know this part only from the Utraquist sources. However, when we look at its melodic shape, we see certain features that link it to Preconia heteroclita. In many places, we find repeated minims and semiminims, and this at times might bring to mind the genre of trumpetum. These small values may yet be reduced to longer notes, mainly semibriefs. In the example here, I return to the two segments of the first part of Praesidiorum Erogatrix, this time in the full version for two voices. We can compare the version from Czerny's edition, based on the Franus codex, with the rhythmic reconstruction suggested by the Göttingen fragments. It's clear that they are very different. In the version with the textless tenor, Praesidiorum Erogatrix resembles somewhat the song Prerumpanus Euduli, uniquely preserved in the Göttingen fragments never published previously. While this is a free voice work with two parts and using color, it's based on the same formal principle, which consists in dividing the song into short sections separated by rests and beginning with an anacrusis. In this way, we have reached the critical point of my lecture. Questions arise that are asked by many editors of music and not only of medieval music. How far can we go in our constructions? If we only have 30% of the music notation of a composition available to us, can we carry out on the basis of various comparisons, analogies, analysis, its full reconstruction? In what sense will this be an authentic version? In our efforts to get to know the originals, are we not guilty of malpractice, creating a version of the work that has no support in any source and is in fact our contemporary version? The temptation to reconstruct is of course great, since the Göttingen fragments contain not only the oldest versions of a number of Petrus pieces, but also undoubtedly were in some way created close to the composer. They contain the largest number of his composition, 13 attributed pieces and 4 doubtful, and were written at a time when Petrus was present in Silesia, where the source was created. This gives grounds for regarding them as a credible source, although unfortunately incomplete. Jaromir Czerny, working mainly on Bohemian sources, was fully aware that they contain distorted versions of Petrus' music. Today, we can confirm with confidence that he was right to hold that opinion. The versions from the Specjalnik or Franus codices are not authentic in the sense of being close to the originals, but at the same time, they are very authentic as documents of the musical culture of literary brotherhoods and Utraquist schools. Let us again recall Czerny's words from his introduction to the edition of Petrus' Opera Musica. Quotation: None of the versions, variants, and arrangements, however different from each other, should be regarded as corrupted originals. They should be treated as specific original musical facts, differentiated in terms of their specific historical conditions and their functions in the environments in which they were performed and listened to. This edition is based on the versions that provide best notation and, as far as possible, are the oldest, obviously bearing in mind that they cannot represent the authentic form of the compositions. When comparing the well-known Bohemian sources with the newly discovered and older sources, such as the Göttingen fragments, we learn a great deal about the musical culture of the Utraquists. We also gain knowledge about the manner of transmission of such music as the songs of Petrus Wilhelmi, transmission that traveled along somewhat more meandering paths than in the case of, for example, many French or Italian works, compositions. The songs discussed today reveal three features of Utraquist editing. Firstly, transforming triple metre into duple metre in older repertory, but carried out quite loosely, disturbing metrical consistency. Secondly, underlaying text in textless voice parts, and so causing a change of the rhythmic structure of the tenors and the transformation of musical texture. Thirdly, transposition of voices, presumably because of the desire to adapt the voice position to the needs of specific ensembles. We can add a fourth feature to these three, one that I have hardly mentioned today. This concerns changes in the musical form. In the case of the first example, Prelusti e Lucentia, it was adding a repetition of the first part, that is changing the form AB to AAB. In the case of Preconia et Roclita, the longer, through composed song was divided in Utraquist sources into two halves, in this way creating the AB form without any repetitions. Petrus Wilhelmi came from the Teutonic order state in Prussia. At the age of 26, he went to study at the University of Krakow and was graduated in 1430 as Magister of Liberal Arts. Around the year 1440, he appears at the court of Frederick III, German king and emperor, where he was one of the many chaplains. We suppose that he traveled a lot. He may have been present at the council in Basel. In 1448, he was most likely in Silesia. In 1452, he traveled to Rome, where Frederick III was crowned emperor. He applied for the post of canon at the cathedral in Frombork in Prussia, and he was the parish priest of the parish of Białogarda in Pomerania, in the Teutonic Order state. We don't know anything about Petrus' visit to Bohemia, but it might easily have been part of his numerous peregrinations. In any case, this is not very significant. By the middle of the 15th century, Petrus' music was known throughout a wide area: Poland, Silesia, Mazovia, Central Germany, Austria, and today's Slovakia. Clearly, it was eagerly copied and performed, and even at that time, it was undergoing various transformations. The first evidence of its presence in Bohemia is relatively late. It comes from around 1450 from Wysokie Myto in Eastern Bohemia. That is also the date that marks the beginning of the popularity of his selected songs and motets among the Utraquists. It seems that they were looking for repertory that was in some way native and not too complex. Much of Petrus' music fitted these requirements to perfection. Although the Specialny Codex, the Franus Codex, or the gradual from Hrudim bring us reshape and distort versions of Petrus' works, as I tried to demonstrate today, you could hardly find more impressive evidence of the reception of his music and poetry. They became an important fragment of the Utraquist musical culture, which, also philological research tells us, involved not only writing, but also memorizing and oral transmission. New sources help us take a different view of Petrus' works from that available to Jaromir Czerny. And even if they do not bring us much closer to the originals, at least they mean that we can be reassured by this certainty. Petrus Wilhelmi had no problem with ordering his rhythms, and he did not compose in parallel fifths. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Paweł. You see so much applause here, at least visually, but I think you can imagine that it sounds like trumpets almost.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I think that we can now start a discussion over this fascinating material that you presented to us. And just let me repeat, you can either raise your hand, you can write your question into the chat, whatever, and please. Questions to the audience, the possibility to ask questions from the audience. You see, we still are very overwhelmed by the funding, and that I think I will have to remember many days that Petrus Wilhelmi did not use fifth, parallel fifth. It's so deep inside. But before the discussion starts, just two observations. It's rather observations rather than questions. First of this is, as for the texting of tenors, Utraquists really liked tropes and prosulas. And the textation, adding new texts, this was for them something that they really cultivated. I think they were the last in the European history who did so, just to write new tropes. And the second observation, I don't know, it could be maybe other colleagues from my Prague colleagues who would write this question. You proposed a new rhythmic organization of it was the first piece where you went in from exactly the rhythmical pattern, short, long, long, short, da 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 da. That is the pattern. This was used very much in vernacular songs in the early 15th century. I wonder if it is something which would have something like mutual influence, because we just edited the Stepnice Cancional song collection. We have several songs there that follow this pattern. So it was quite interesting. I don't know if you had any thoughts about this.
Yes, in these early songs by Petrus, there are many so-called this modal patterns of rhythmics. So iambic or trochaic rhythm combined together in some way, and particularly in this song it's very visible, but generally in this earlier song preserved in early sources in Opava and also other, it's very visible. In later songs, this which appeared in sources from 40s, it's more mensural rhythm, but it's very, very typical. And yes, they like text generally. So I think Utraquists, it seems that they would like to perform this polyphonic music just vocally, not using instrument. And as I see, there's a question from Barbara Haik-Iglo. So Utraquist do not play instruments. There are only vocal ensemble, of course, and it's why they vocalize these tenors in some way. So maybe not vocalize, but yes, vocalize adding text. And so there are some later compositions by Petrus Wilhelmi, which are really composed in this very typical texture, which we called Burgundian texture of chanson. So it could be, of course, performed by instruments. And Barbara Haik also asked me, and what about use of Latin by Utraquists? Yes, as they use Latin widely, I think, the 60s, 30s, in fact, maybe even later. But these graduals and cancionals, which at least I know, so they are mostly Latin till the, let's say, second quarter of the 16th century. But then it starts to be translated or reshaped in some way, and was really pure Czech graduals and cancionals.
Adam Gilbert has a question.
Thank you. What a wonderful paper. Thank you, Paweł.
Thank you.
I had a comment and a question. My first comment was that you, in describing the idea of not finding the single version of it, but treating them all as real true versions of the piece, you did a beautiful job of describing what medievalist Paul Zumthor called mouvance, which is that idea that you're not looking for the original piece, you're looking for the whole family of variants as part of that tradition. So that was beautiful. I had a question for you about Praesidiorum
Erogatrix.
Yes, thank you. And that is, you did such a wonderful job of turning pieces into perfect kind of tempus or C dot time. And the Praesidiorum, in your example, could there be even more examples of sort of coloration cadential figures? I see you have yum, pum, pim, pum, pum, yum, pum, 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 pum. Are there more possible interpretations even going farther? Or is there something, because I look at the prorumpanus, I made a screenshot,
yes,
where the tenor cadences are long, short, long, as opposed to short, long, long. Is that just a feature of being consonant, or are there possible more suspensions intended anywhere along the way?
Yes, so I based on sources, and what I see in sources is exactly these versions you mentioned. As I discovered, in fact, there are two types of so Petrus Wilhelmi started composing, I think, when he was student in Krakow or maybe earlier, and these early songs are really very simple without any coloration and this modernism and so on. But in later composition, we see such examples as you mentioned, and especially this Prorumpanus Euduli is particularly advanced, let's say, composition. It was written firstly, and the only copy is preserved in Göttingen fragments. I had even problem with this composition. I was not sure whether it is really by Petrus, because it's really more advanced in the sense of rhythm and all these details. But then I compared with many other compositions, and now I'm rather sure that it's by him. Although it's not very typical, it's quite different in comparison to Preludia, Lucentia, or other early songs. But yes.
Elżbieta Witkowska has a question. Elżbieta, you are muted. You are muted. You have to turn on your phone.
Okay,
Yeah,
yes. Paweł, it was an excellent presentation, and thank you very much. I would like to ask you about textual variants, because you showed us in a very convincing way musical variants. And what about the text? are there always identical, and perhaps some more comments about texts as such? That is my question.
Thank you for this question. It's a very pertinent question. Yes, so the text by Petrus, it's a whole story, because sometimes there are many texts which are really complicated. And so there are so many neologisms, and sometimes it's really difficult to translate and to really be sure whether what this text means. There are many Grecism and so on. But yes, maybe one thing, it's the text itself. They are simply built and in very regular form. There's usually A, B, A rhythms and very well organized strophes, verses, and so on. It's problem of some words which are not so clear and some readings which are not so clear. Generally, they are devotional, of course, and as I mentioned, there are some problems with some readings. But I tried also to compare some texts, for instance, Prelusti e Lucentia and other songs, and there are also a mixture of different texts in songs preserved, for instance, in Utraquist sources. Sometimes I'm really sure that they added new strophes. Sometimes I'm really sure that they recomposed some strophes. But by analyzing and by using another song, sometimes you can discover how it worked at the beginning. And I try to do such reconstructions, but it rather concerns the using of some variants and some strophes, but there are still many issues relating to some particularly uniquely preserved songs and motets in Göttingen fragments. And as you know, I even sent you one examples, and it's really quite complicated. So it's a whole story. So there's some information in my book. So I hope that with help of some classical philologists, I will be able to read more deeply these texts.
Thank you.
We still have time for other questions. Alenka Hlavková has a question. Lenka, we can't hear you, Lenka.
Oh, it's better now.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and it's nice to hear that you are going to prepare a new edition of Petrus' works. And you also think about a new recording of some of his pieces, because, as you mentioned, we know some pieces in versions which are circulating, and yes, and you know, if you ask David Eben about Prelusti e Lucentia, he says that this Utraquist version comes automatically into his mind, and it's very difficult for him to switch into the other one. And I think probably it would be interesting to also to make recordings of different versions, and also in let's say different let's say combinations of voices, instruments, or purely vocal, because these versions belonged to certain milieus and functioned in certain milieus, and then we could have an opportunity to compare really same pieces but different sound, and of course different features like tenors and so on. So just my comment.
Thank you very much. Of course. So as you remember, it was a story with David Eben and Preluzia Lucentia, because it's really well-known song and many times performed by Schola Gregoriana Pragensis. As you know, David Eben is a leader of this ensemble. And it is something important, I think, for memorization of music, that it was so complicated to him to start to find this new rhythm instead of this one preserved in Utraquist sources. So really, in some way, he automatically start always to sing this melody in this way, like in Utraquist sources. But I'm sure that, of course, even Schola Gregoriana Pragensis will be happy to perform not Utraquist versions of the songs and in a new manner. In fact, not so complicated still. And of course, it will be nice to hear such examples. So my problem, my issue is mainly with Praesidiorum Erogatrix and this possibly reconstruction of tenor, because in fact I have no another tenor than Utraquist sources, but I can reconstruct this without any problems using another sources and using this data I showed you. But my question is whether I should do this. So if you can help me in some way, what do you think about this? I will be very welcome.
We have a follow-up question from Barbara.
Yes, Barbara. Aha, so there's a comment about, yes, conception. Thank you for this, Barbara.
And there is a question about the compliance.
Yes, yes. So we should remember generally, because I mentioned here the works by Petrus in the context of Utraquist church and Utraquist practice. But as earlier sources shows, the reception of his music was much wider. And we have, in fact, many manuscripts which was not connected with Utraquist and strict church institutions, but were rather connected with universities, schools, monasteries. But so it's maybe another function. It was not, so in my imagination, it was, of course, it could be part of liturgy as a paraliturgical composition, but it was also maybe performed in the context of a kind of devotion, also outside of the liturgy and church. And also there are some compositions which are not so like motet probitate eminentem is rather satirical composition. It's not church composition. So it was rather connected at the beginning, I think, before Utraquist times. It was connected with this schools, university, teacher, pupils performing in different contexts, maybe as a devotion, not so private because you need at least 2 singers for this, but in some kind unofficial, not connected with liturgical performance. So, and Adam again, question.
Encouragement to do the reconstruction.
Thank you.
I think we still have time for.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Still have time for some questions. So Mike Beauvoir, I hope I pronounced it correctly, comments, it's not safe to assume that the use of coloration indicates an increase in Petrus skills over time or a change in style. The works
yes.
may be very,
Yes, it's a very...
Yes, sorry. Paweł,
yes, thank you. It's a very nice comment. Thank you, Mike, for this comment. So I agree. In fact, it could be in this way, as you suggested. So it's very possible, I think. Especially in the context of Utraquist sources, because sometimes I can see a kind of simplification of the versions. There are some details which can show this direction that it was in some simplified in some way. Yes, Schedel Liederbuch and cadential colorations. Yes. In fact, this coloration you saw it was very widespread. This kind of coloration, of course, at times.
So, some last questions or comments? I see that no comments coming. So Paweł, many thanks again for this very, very interesting talk, and thank you having time. You did really great without experience in teaching. You were really great also on technical side. So many, many thanks again. Before you all leave, two small announcements. First of all, we have the next lecture in this series by Zsuzsa Czagany already in the coming month, lecture that was postponed, which was originally scheduled for March. And this is the invitation that we will have posted also on our website. It will be on, as Zsuzsa says, a very, very fascinating manuscript of the 12th century Hungary, on sacramentary from Hungary. We know that we don't have too many manuscripts from representing early music and liturgical history from Hungary. So you are very much welcome. Please join us again if you have time and interest. And the second announcement before you leave, we can stay just for, if you grab your coffee and come, stay on the screen if you want to have an informal chat before you disappear from the screen. So you are very much welcome to stay at least for a couple of minutes for just social talk. So thank you very much again, joining us wherever you are. Have a nice morning or evening, and we will be very much looking to see you again at our next lecture. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.